this trial, as previously mentioned, more people had started getting accused of witchcraft from Salem Village to Salem Town and other communities as well. It became a huge panic. About 10 people were held in jail around April, and the jail was considered to simply be a primary holding cell just for those awaiting for trial. It was not properly equipped for anyone who would be there for a prolonged period of time. But this was not the case. Almost everyone who was accused was held for several months on end, and it was essentially a wooden deep freeze in the winter and a blazing oven in the summer, and a place where hygiene was literally a pot of water up against the wall where everyone would just share their nasty bath water. So it was not ideal. And the jail housed so many more people over time because if you were a witch, it was assumed that your friends and close acquaintances could be as well. So Sarah Good, for example, who was one of the first accused, was actually jailed with her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas. And after about 8 months in the jail, her young daughter literally went insane, which I believe any child would who is housed in a holding facility full of accused witches. And as soon as you were convicted, your life was essentially ruined. Your reputation was tarnished in the village, and you were interrogated quite heavily. They stripped down the witches so that investigators could look for marks known as witches' teats. A little gross. Apparently, the devil communicated with his witches via animals like mice and birds who would crawl up the witch and suck on a teat located on her body, which would leave marks. I'd never heard of that until researching for this video, and that is disgusting. I'm so glad that was not continued through mainstream media to be a normal thing. So to add insult to injury, with these women who are already destroyed, they actually had to pay for their own room and board. Yeah, while they were in jail. If you wanted to eat or drink, you have to pay for it, as well as new straw and bedding, unless you essentially wanted to sleep on a wooden plank. So that's a lot of money and a lot of profit to be made with housing witches and having more people in this holding cell. And all of that money went to Sheriff George Corwin, who was the nephew to one of the magistrates, the judges. So, in my opinion, a massive conflict of interest. And he was considered to not only be related to one of the magistrates, but several other members in courts. So there was no way that those people didn't know what he was doing to the witches. He would confiscate any of their property, which he did have no legal right to do so. But people believed that Corwin specifically used these witch hunts and would help pinpoint people to accuse because he could collect more money. So some people were profiting off of this entire situation, and others were specifically using this to even old scores. It was an opportunity for them, especially since in Salem, bitter, long-standing disputes were fairly common. So like, hey, I haven't liked you for years. I'll just say you're a witch and watch you die. It happened just a few years prior in the 1670s. People would often sue each other, take people years. They'd supported the idea of Salem Village having their own church, but many others would rather walk the 5 miles into Salem town, and they would prefer that because having their own church in the village meant double the taxes simply for the convenience of having one closer. Back then, they really didn't care about walking to and from. This actually divided Salem into 2 factions, one being the church supporters and others being the church opponents who did not want to spend this money. Interestingly enough, the church supporters were all of the accusers pointing their fingers at others, and the non-supporters, that faction, were all of the witches, the accused witches. So it's very interesting. Who knew history would be so petty? So Thomas Putnam and the women in his family, his daughter, wife, niece, and even his servant Mercy Lewis, were behind 181 accusations of witchcraft. Thomas's brother Edward participated in 13 cases himself, and his brother-in-law an additional 7 witch hunts. This family was very spiteful, and they also were relentless in their accusations. You know, I don't know what Empress wore, but I assume she didn't try and look like a weird version, Walmart version of Trixie Mattel. If you're new here, I'm very weird with my true crime. So, anyone who did the Putnam clan wrong were dragged into court on cases of witchcraft, such as Reverend George Burroughs. George was a Harvard graduate, witty, married 3 times, and held Samuel Parris's job prior 10 years earlier. The period of his ministry was very contentious. They withheld his salary, and due to this, he ended up asking the Putnam family if he could borrow some money. He then did not repay them and was taken to courts. However, he successfully disputed them, stating that he really couldn't pay them back the money until the town had paid his initial salary, which makes sense. Though it was finally repaid over time, the Putnam family were humiliated in court by him. So it's not a coincidence that suddenly his name had came up during these witch trials. George was working as a preacher in the remote settlement of Maine, and he had survived several brutal attacks that had killed even Mercy's relatives previously. But the witch hunts were a very different story for him. The Putnams being very vengeful, and on the evening of April 20th, 1692, Anne Putnam Jr. had claimed that the invisible being of George Burroughs had came to her and confessed to her that he was not only the leader of the witches, but that he had previously killed his 2 wives and had killed the wife and daughter of his predecessor, all while bewitching the soldiers who were fighting against the Indians in the frontier. Now that specific claim is a huge soft spot for people, as previously mentioned. So it had been at this point 5 because of this calm demeanor. He was then arrested, and the attention of all of Massachusetts was on him. They knew about the minister and how he had never been formally ordained by the Puritan Church. So he never successfully had an organized congregation. So he represents to the church-loving people of Massachusetts all that shove them from the ladder, their neck would not break, and they would simply suffocate to death in front of everyone. So, not quick and not painless, incredibly dramatic for those viewing, and that actually was the case for one of the judges who had witnessed the hanging and had left in protest, saying that he was disgusted by the situation was a crime that she simply did not commit, and she was hung for not confessing. Really doesn't make sense, does it? 7 more were hung afterward, and there really was a resistance building to these witch hunts, and people had ended up becoming martyrs. They would die, but they would die never being convicted of witchcraft, which people really, really stood for what they believed in back then. Some people were waiting for their moment to come out and say, this is insanity, we must stop. However, they had to wait and bide their time, because if they spoke up too soon, they could be accused of being a witch themselves. By mid-September, the debate had become very loud in Boston. Thomas Brattle was a wealthy Boston merchant who openly started criticizing the judge's methods. He thought that they were contradictory, forcing people to confess and then vindicating them. And he was absolutely right. A then 17-year-old Margaret Jacobs, who had previously confessed to being a witch, was really starting to question her own actions. From her confession and her pointing fingers, she had not only sent George Burroughs to his death, but her own grandfather. So, the day after her grandfather was executed, she had written a letter to the judges saying that it was not only a false confession, but noting that she was told if she wasn't to confess that she would be hung. So she saved herself, but felt responsible for the death of others and was no longer interested in playing this game. Soon, many others who'd confessed to witchcraft and were safe had come forward admitting they were told to do so. And soon the court had no choice but to go after those who had cooperated with them, as they had to in order to vindicate their image. But not surprisingly, soon enough, everyone stopped confessing. The wild accusations of witchcraft then came to a halt, and Reverend Mather wrote a plea to the court. Puritan minister Increase Mather asked the court not to consider spectral evidence in trials on October 3rd in 1692. Around the same time, Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, was brought in for interrogation, and she was the wife of the man who literally created the court. After Mather's had sent his statement and his wife's interrogation was complete, he had released some of the people whom were jailed for witchcraft and halted all further arrests. He had then replaced the court with the Superior Court of Judicature, which was not permitted to consider testimonies of spectral evidence. When the courts opened and spectral evidence was no longer allowed, there were still 49 trials to be held for those accused of witchcraft. 3 had died in prison while waiting for their trial, and 3 were convicted of witchcraft, but they were dismissed and their cases were thrown out. Tituba was released 1 year later, and to a new master, because Reverend Paris refused to pay for her fees that she had accumulated while in jail, which is bull, but okay. In the end, about 25 people of the trials were hung and executed, 14 women and 6 men. prison awaiting for their trials. All accused were predominantly women between the ages of 9 and 20, and the majority of the accusations had came from either the Putnam family or men, oddly enough, in the village. In the end, almost all of those who were executed were not given a proper burial. Instead, they were buried in unmarked graves in the area. They're not sure where they are to this day, but it is believed that they are buried on Gallows Hill, as this place has a reputation for being extremely haunted. So there are several theories that people have put together as to why these things happened in Salem, and here are the most popular. So theory 1 suggests that the Little Ice Age that lasted between 1550 and 1800 and intensified between 1680 and 1730 caused economic problems that encouraged the population to blame one another for their hardships, so they were bored. The second theory is from a behavioral scientist who believes that the girls were exposed to a kind of fungus called ergot. This can be found in grains like rye, which can cause convulsive ergotism, which causes hallucinations similar to LSD, muscle contractions, vertigo, and crawling and tingling sensations. Not only did that rye grow there, but other signs were shown, such as disintegrated fingertips. But the fact that their convulsions and hallucinations were at the exact same time always disproves this, because everyone's body filters everything so differently. You can experience it at different levels. So it kind of debunks that theory, which is the most popular. The third is mass hysteria, which is actually accepted and written about in most literature about the trials, that some level of hysteria was exhibited in Salem at that time. And the final is from Robert Califf, who was actually there at the time of the trials. He was a merchant who actually accused Reverend Paris of exploiting the trials for social gain and political gain in the community. He proposed that Reverend Paris had forced his slave to confess to witchcraft so he could use the resulting paranoia to seize back his diminishing power in Salem. So I definitely believe that partially, but personally I think that everything stated with the Putnam family, with everything, and the way the story that I had found was told, I truly believe that it was orchestrated, and there was one prominent person who initially started it, but everyone got involved, started believing it, and made it what it was. And I believe that there were some who didn't necessarily believe in it, but used it for their own personal gain as well, such as the sheriff. But honestly, we will never know the real truth. But in 1957, the state of Massachusetts formally apologized for the Salem witch trials. And in 1992, 300 years after the trial, a memorial in Salem was dedicated by Nobel laureate author watching